Ash was the real masterstroke, I think, in that he was completely... That was a one-off, wasn't it? That's the first time, you know, you have corporate paranoia, right? That in there you've got a suit on the ship. The difference is the suit is a robot, is a humanoid. So when Ash suddenly became peculiar, he goes peculiar on Sigourney. And he says, I can explain everything when he's over her shoulder in the mother's womb. And she suddenly is spooked by him and realizes he's not what he seems to be. Then he goes strange and he has the sweat of milk here. And then he has to goes at it. And I always thought that was interesting, that do humanoids have sexual urges? You know, what would be nice is that this is the closest he ever gets to a sexual relationship. Then they come in and knock his head off, then you go from Ash to a very small person underneath, running around with, if you watch it carefully, rather dodgy arms, okay? That's the dodgy moment. But it's taken up by the shock. The slack is taken up by the shock of, Jesus, a robot, then getting bashed and bashed by Yaphet. And then you've got Ian with his head stuck to the table, lying in a sea of milk and caviar and pasta and glass marbles. I thought the glass marbles were great. They're like memory, clear glass marbles. And poor Ian had to, every time I'd do a take, I'd give him, he hated milk as well, I'd give him a little bit of milk. So he'd say, "Ready?" And then he'd start to talk. And then we then grizzled it up afterwards, gave it a little bit of effervescence on sound.
All other priorities rescinded.
And then incineration. Then it becomes really scary, because he says, that's a great speech. That speech came later, which I think Hill and Guyler had to write. We had to write that Ash is saying it's not, it's indestructible.
You have my sympathies.
Yeah, the head's like that, and then you cut in like... But I thought the head was very beautifully articulated, but I think something went wrong in the drying process. I think, you know, they've changed the level and quality of latexes today, but in those days it shrunk, and he said it shrunk. I said, because he took a head cast, how could it not look like Ian? He said it shrank. I said, oh, God, you want to come back and redo it? No, we couldn't. So we had to get on with it. There was no coming back on that kind of budget. You got to keep going.
At the end of the first week of shooting, I asked to look at some dailies, and Gordon Carroll said, "You're not allowed to come to dailies." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Those are privileged." I said, "Gordon," I said, "surely if anyone has a right to look at dailies, it's me." On his picture, Gordon said, "Sue me." Right, Gordon did a much simpler thing than suing him. I went up in the projection booth with the projectionist. I stood and I looked. And I looked, and I saw it, and I was impressed. I was pleased. I said, "Oh, yeah." I said, "That looks good." And for the first time, I began to see the value of getting a director whose focus was so strongly on the photographic look of a film.
I think pretty soon we all knew, you only got to see the dailies, etc., to know that something, you know, quite special is happening.
Morning, Captain.
The glory of the cinema is that it is an audience that is seeing it, and therefore it is a collective understanding, which is quite different from watching something on tape. it has a blend of the actual theatre itself, even though what you're going to see is always exactly the same. It can vary from audience to audience according to whatever collection of people you have there.
The first screening of the movie, which ran, I think, about 4 hours long, from a 78-page screenplay. And we were supposed to go out to lunch afterwards. I was with my ex-wife, and she was so traumatized, she couldn't leave the room for a day and a half. It was more violent and more frightening, actually, at the long cut that it ended up to be.
We never really previewed it till we finished the film, which was interesting. But we finished it and we had a 70mm print and we took it to Fox. And they insisted the day we arrived, we just arrived that afternoon, that they wanted to run it that night in their dubbing theatre, the Zanuck Theatre. And they invited all the science fiction sort of people who had come in dressed up as most of the creatures you'd ever seen to see the film. And it ran terribly because the sound was so bad in there. And we never could understand it because we had a great soundtrack. We've never changed it.
Then we had one in St. Louis where the sound wasn't quite right, and that was okay.
Ridley went crazy because he went down and checked the theater before the screening, and 2 of the speakers were out, and then he didn't want to screen the picture.
And by this time, they are completely convinced that we'd made a bad soundtrack in England, and the wrong thing had arrived.
But we were all quite worried after the one in St. Louis. And then in Dallas, the next night, we had the sound absolutely right in the theater.
Let's get out of here.
We've got this far, we must go on.
We arrive in this theatre, which was run by these guys. You could have eaten off their floor. The theatre was fantastic. The sound was great. It was the most incredible preview I've ever been in. I mean, people were screaming and running out of the theatre.
From what I remember, Ridley and Ivor Powell were holding down Alan Ladd Jr., who was trying to get out of the cinema.
The usher keeled over, and not with a chestburster scene, strangely enough. People were just too stunned at that particular moment that they didn't react.
This was a through-the-roof preview. This is when we knew we really had something. In fact, there was one of the ushers fainted. They're all, they were worried about violence in the theaters and all the rest of this kind of stuff. And said, "Oh my God, there's an incident here. What's happened?" And the usher had fainted when the robot's head came off.
We had the management saying, this is terrible. All the people are being sick everywhere, and it's in a state. And we thought, this is great.
At first, I was standing in the back of the theater. I was saying, "What's going on? People are getting a lot of walkouts, But what it was that people were sitting close to the screen or walking back to stand and watch it in the back of the theater. They didn't want to be that close to the screen, because it was scary.
Some of the most exciting, I think, moments of my life, because there's no greater buzz than being involved in a movie, and suddenly, not only was I going to the States for the first time in my life, but I was actually being flown around with Ridley in the 20th Century Fox executive jet from preview to preview.
We never had a premiere for this movie. And I paid for my own ticket down at Egyptian Theatre to go, and I stood in line to go see this movie. I mean, it was like so totally bizarre. I wanted to see it with with an audience. People were getting up and leaving the theater and going out and barfing in the lobby. I mean, I guess it was just such a shock to everyone. I mean, we knew how it was made, and it was, our friend on the little dolly being squidgied underneath the chair and stuff. But boy, I tell you, when it was cut together, it really was pretty amazing.
When we opened the film, I was staying at a friend's house in the Hollywood Hills there, looking down. I could see the Egyptian Theatre from where I was. And they opened it, and they ran it for 48 hours non-stop. It was just running like a loop for 48 hours. There was never a moment in that 48 hours that the queue wasn't round the block.
I got up that day. I was a complete nervous wreck. I was angry. I was angry at the world. I had not been shown proper respect on this movie. I wasn't even going to go to the opening. The hell with them. I'm not going to go to the opening of this thing.
Dan somehow had a bad experience. I remember this sticks out of my mind because of Dark Star. He remembers coming and thinking, "Mom, my God," and nobody laughed, and nobody responded, and nobody came. And when they did, they didn't laugh at any of the jokes. That's what he said to me, "I'll never try another comedy again." So he kept on feeling this fear that it was going to fall on its face like Dark Star did.
I jumped in my car and I just drove around the streets. I drove around L.A. crazily. Nowhere. I just drove. I was mad. I'll show him. I'll this. I'll that.
I guess he got drunk or something because he almost didn't want to come. He said, "I can't take it."
I'm not going with that. At 7:55, I suddenly turned the wheel and ran. Well, I drove like a rocket into Hollywood. I drove up and I parked somewhere and I got out. And I saw this huge line of people. It went down the block and around the block. And I said, "Is that for Alien?" And I got out and I walked the whole length of the line. I walked all this long line. They were all lined up to see Alien, my movie. And I sort of walked up. I drifted up towards the opening, the entrance there of the Egyptian. And I got up there, and there was Ronnie Shusett and a couple of people.
He was like a man possessed. I mean, he was just like terrified.
I said, "Where you been? Come in here." And they took me in, and we went inside. I floated in, and the theater, every seat was full, and they put me down in a seat somewhere, and I sat there. I was kind of numb. It was like a dream. The house lights went down. The 20th Century Fox logo came up, and the whole audience cheered. Yay!
And we heard these tremendous shrieks and cheers and applause. And about the third scare in, and Dan was sitting behind me, and he started weeping.
And my eyes flooded with tears, and the tears just ran down my face. And I just sat there and watched the movie.
And I said, Dan, and he said, "I can't believe it. It's real. It's real." You know, and he was just crying through the whole... Here's everybody cheering. He's this guy behind me crying.
Limp as a rag. And I had expected there, of course, to be moments where they would scream at the shock. And I'd expected a lot of nervous muttering and tittering, all that stuff. Wasn't what happened at all. The audience sat in absolute silence, unmoving, just staring at that screen.
Like all of us, we can't be objective about our own work. Even when he went to the previews, he just wasn't sure. He thought, "Oh, maybe it's just those audiences are they're prone to love it, and nobody else is going to like it. Maybe not the masses that aren't the science fiction lovers." But you could tell that crowd, they went wild. I mean, they were just standing and cheering at the end of the movie.
I saw it at the Egyptian. First time I saw it in its entirety. A lot of them had come up and were standing in front. They'd walked out on the movie. And I thought, cool, it can't be that bad, right? So I go in there, watch the movie, right? And I'm quite excited by what's happening. And I thought the pacing, cutting was brilliant, right? And then when Sigourney goes back to pick up her cat, I had this wonderful African-American voice shut up, "Leave the fucking cat!" And at that stage I knew that Ridley had got a hit.
I had the space jockey in front.
I understand somebody tried to set fire to it or something, because they thought it was the work of the devil. Great.
By then, we had already had, the night before, I'd been to the Academy, and that's a tougher audience because they're filmmakers, and it takes a lot to impress them. But when that went so amazingly, sitting behind me was Jack Nicholson and Warren Beatty, and they kept screaming like two little boys at every scare. And they came up to Dan and I later and said, "Oh, it's amazing, guys." And they're, "My God, it's Warren Beatty and Jack Nicholson," you know, and they scared the shit out of us. So we were just beaming, and that's a tougher audience.
It was so new in its concept of horror. I think it was more of a thriller because apart from those little odd horrid moments that things happen, it was a thriller. When's it going to happen next?
My reaction was right with them. It was a wave. We were like a tidal wave building up and crashing on the shore with apprehension. I do remember a story that Ridley told me about meeting with some theater owners after the picture had been released, and this one guy came up to me and says, "I tell you, you know that that one scene where that thing comes out of the stomach, I tell you, it really messed up our bathrooms, and I take a great deal of pride in our bathrooms, but we took care of that. We took care of that." Ridley says, "Well, how did you take care of that?" He said, "Oh, we just cut it out of the picture, and anyway, the bathrooms were fine after that."
I've often wondered in Alien how many eyes closed at the moment that I gave birth, as I like to put it. But, and I'm sure that it's over 50% in the first time of seeing it. And I'm sure that some people took 4 times before they actually saw it.
Women of a certain age, probably childbearing and upwards age, or certainly women in their 30s and 40s for some extraordinary psychological reason, were very, very put off by the chest burster, by the birth scene. I think they found it, you know, deeply Freudianly disturbing. And I think that stopped it actually being an even bigger hit.
The chest bursting scene certainly worked, and you'd just hear this dead silence from the audience. They couldn't believe what they were seeing, you know. I then realized, you know, how effective it was on an audience, you know, and people won't you know, have heard so much about it, they won't even see it. They're terrified to see it, and people who have seen it regret it, you know, and others just can't get enough.
They were so terrified. I mean, even I was terrified because they'd added, it has the most amazing sound. And between the water and the steam and the smoke and our performances and the music, you're terrified the entire time. I think I watched it through my cable net sweater. It's like that. Because once you added all that, I wasn't Ripley, you know, who doesn't get afraid.
They were terrified. They'd never seen a movie like this. It just came at them, relentless claustrophobia. And the power of this movie is any horror film, you get inside the psychology of fear, and those are inherent, certain amount of things that are in people, things growing inside you, and the way that robots are as humans, and you're not quite sure who is who, and the claustrophobia of a setting where you're enclosed and can't get out of.
I went to see it in Twickenham, in a huge cinema, and I was terrified. I can't remember the audience reaction because I can only remember my own. And I screamed, and I was absolutely... And I knew, of course I knew the script. I knew that the creature was going to burst forth, but it made no difference. I was petrified.
People were so into it. It was the first time we'd shown space to be a real place, you know, filthy, greasy, grimy, with real people in it, you know. It was certainly the opposite of 2001, which is a movie I've always found it hard to sit through, frankly, because it's so sterile and still. And this was, you know, and it was, I have to say, so much of Ridley in it, his no bullshit kind of approach.
Exciting opening. It broke all the house records. It was a very good ad campaign, I thought, simple but creepy at the same time. I think the team of Fox, the people of Fox at that point in time, none of which are there anymore, really got behind the picture and sold it as hard as they could and believed in it very strongly.
The graphics we brought in were 2 great guys. There was Steve Frankfurt, who was, you know, pretty formidable advertising man, and Richard Greenberg, who came in with, first of all, coming into poster work, and then they came up with a great log line, you know, in space no one can hear you scream. And then the typography, wide space to the top, I thought looked great. And then they readapted that to go on the film as the opening title sequence, which was a kind of form of hieroglyphics, really, or a readout. You know what it is. And then it gradually spells Alien.
Alien fulfilled a genre, and thereby put a cap on it.
Alien to me is very special, and it's not just because I worked on it. I think Ridley did such an amazing job on it, and I think it's got a mythology to it.
Until they start making feature movies in IMAX or in virtual reality, I don't think it's going to be possible to do anything that's that novel in the scary sci-fi monster vein.
The thing that made Alien scary was the fact that you weren't quite sure what you were seeing, so the audience could participate.
It was quite a milestone. It was sort of like Howard Hawks' The Thing, which was the first film I can remember where they used a science fiction element as an element of horror to really frighten you, and this was the next ultimate step.
The alien is frightening in a context much larger than outer space science fiction beings. It's fearsome in the way a child's nightmare is frightening.
It's becoming more difficult to just frighten people. Frighten people on a nice level, on an entertaining level, on a roller coaster ride. I think it's really why I've never done another science fiction between Blade Runner and this. I thought I hit space and the urban side of the world and sci-fi. And so, in a funny kind of way, it's good because I'll only do another science fiction if I've got a really good script. So it really, finally, it's about the story. It's all about the story. The trappings, the dressing is not insignificant. It's important, and it's an art form in itself, but it's not the priority.
Ridley's Alien is actually of a different genre from the other aliens, I think. How can one put it? It's a sort of realistic approach, as I say, a logical approach using a thriller format, which I think was terrifically successful, and I think you can follow the whole possibility of that, particularly as more and more we know about our universe and so on, the more possible it becomes all the time. So it's not going to get unfashionable. The other aliens I would put into a different genre. I would say that they were more action-adventure films.
It's one of the great franchises that we have in today's cinema, and I think it would be not very hard and not very difficult to turn it back into where it came from. I would go back to the roots of where the first one was, which is the scary monster in the dark. That is it going to jump out on you? Is it going to get you?
I would have gone before, because that's what I find interesting. I want to know who that space jockey is. Well, you know, what are the aliens doing in the silo? Are they armaments? Are they shipping them somewhere? All that, and I think that, for me, is fascinating.
I mean, that's what we're meant to do. You can, you know, end it and bash it on the head and bury it, but I think you can just as easily invent the end of one, the beginning of another.